I was 3 weeks into analyzing the Henderson testimony when I noticed the first inconsistency. Not in what Robert Henderson claimed happened aboard the craft in 1987, but in what he said they told him about theological history. The details were too specific, too architectural. The kind of specificity that doesn't come from fabrication or sleep paralysis or the usual explanatory frameworks we apply to abduction accounts. Henderson was a hydraulic engineer from Boise, 58 years old when I interviewed him in 2019. No history of mental illness, no religious background beyond occasional Christmas services as a child. He reported his experience to MUFON in 1988, underwent hypnotic regression in 1989, then went silent for 30 years. When he finally agreed to speak with me, it was with the condition that I verify certain claims before publication. Claims about historical events he said the entities had described to him. Events that, according to Henderson, involved a figure he recognized as Jesus of Nazareth. I'm not a theologian. My background is in comparative mythology and anthropological linguistics. I've spent 15 years documenting abduction narratives across 43 countries, looking for pattern consistency that might suggest something beyond psychological or cultural contamination. The Henderson case appeared in my database as a statistical outlier. 7 other abductees, spanning 1961 to 2003, reported nearly identical information about what these entities called the Nazarene intervention. None of these individuals knew each other. 3 were from countries where Christianity held minimal cultural influence. 2 reported their experiences before they had any exposure to Christian theology. The theological claim itself was straightforward enough to summarize, though its implications were not. According to these testimonies, the entities stated that the historical Jesus was part of a systematic effort to introduce what they termed consciousness bridging to human populations. The crucifixion, they claimed, was not metaphorical resurrection, but a demonstration of a technology they had provided, a technology related to what happens to human consciousness after biological death. And according to these beings, that technology is still in operation. I started with the assumption that this was mimetic contamination. Cultural narratives about alien intervention in human history have existed since the 1950s. The idea that extraterrestrials influenced religious figures appears in dozens of fringe publications. What made the Henderson cluster different was the consistency of technical details. Details that didn't match any published material I could locate. Details that, in 3 cases, were reported before similar concepts appeared in public discourse. The entities Henderson described matched a profile that appears in roughly 18% of abduction literature. Bipedal, approximately 6 feet tall, gray-blue skin tone, large eyes with visible pupils rather than the typical black almond shape, hands with 4 fingers. These beings are usually reported as secondary figures in abduction scenarios, present but less interactive than the more commonly described gray entities. Henderson called them the architects. He said they only spoke to him once, during his 3rd experience aboard the craft, and that conversation lasted what he estimated to be 40 minutes. I obtained the original hypnotic regression transcripts from Dr. Marion Voss, the psychologist who worked with Henderson in 1989. Voss died in 2007, but her archives were donated to the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies. The transcripts included details Henderson hadn't mentioned in his MUFON report. Specific terminology. References to structures he claimed to have been shown. Descriptions of what these beings said human consciousness becomes after death, and how the crucifixion event was designed to prove this to human witnesses in a way that would persist across centuries. The afterlife model they described to Henderson doesn't match traditional Christian eschatology. It doesn't match any major religious framework I'm aware of. They claimed human consciousness is a form of structured energy that naturally disperses after biological death unless actively preserved. The preservation process, according to these entities, requires what Henderson translated as pattern anchoring. They said the Nazarene event was a public demonstration of pattern anchoring performed at a scale visible enough to establish lasting proof. The resurrection, in their account, was Jesus' consciousness being successfully re-embodied after a brief period of clinical death. Not a miracle, a procedure. I cross-referenced this with the other 6 cases in my database that mentioned similar claims. The terminology varied. Pattern anchoring appeared in 2 other testimonies, both from the 1970s. A 1998 case from Japan used the phrase consciousness template preservation. A 2001 case from Brazil described it as energy signature stabilization. But the underlying mechanism described was identical. Human consciousness naturally fragments and dissipates approximately 48 to 72 hours after death unless intervention occurs. The intervention involves what multiple abductees described as grid structures, or lattice fields, that hold the pattern of individual consciousness intact. These entities reportedly told Henderson that this technology has been maintained around Earth since approximately 2,000 years ago. That every human consciousness since that point has been subject to this preservation process. That what religions call the afterlife is actually consciousness existing in a preserved state within these lattice structures, waiting for what they termed the collection phase. I'm aware of how this sounds. I've read the literature on religious ideation in psychological trauma. I understand pattern recognition errors and the human tendency to find meaning in random data. I've rejected 90% of the cases in my database for exactly these reasons. But the Henderson cluster kept presenting verification points. The first verification came from architectural descriptions. Henderson claimed he was shown what he described as the grid itself. Under hypnosis in 1989, he drew diagrams of geometric structures he said surrounded the planet. Complex lattice patterns with specific angular relationships. Found nearly identical diagrams in the testimony of Margaret Cho, a South Korean abductee whose experience was documented in 1976. Cho had no access to Henderson's unpublished drawings. The angular relationships matched within 2 degrees. Both described the structures as existing in what Henderson called a layer above normal space, and Cho described as between the world of form and the world of energy. The second verification was historical. The entities allegedly told Henderson that the crucifixion demonstration was designed to satisfy specific evidential requirements. It needed to be public enough to generate multiple witness accounts, but contained enough to avoid mass panic. It needed to show death occurring in a verifiable way, then consciousness returning to the same biological form. And it needed to happen within a cultural context that would preserve and transmit the account across centuries, even if the technological explanation was lost. I spent 4 months analyzing historical crucifixion practices in the Roman Empire. The standard procedure was designed to maximize suffering duration, not ensure quick death. Victims typically survived for days. Death by crucifixion normally resulted from asphyxiation as the body fatigued. But the Gospel accounts describe Jesus dying within hours, and specifically mention blood and water flowing from the spear wound. Modern medical analysis suggests this detail indicates cardiac rupture or pericardial effusion, conditions that would cause rapid death and leave specific physiological evidence. What interested me was the burial timing. Jewish law required burial before the Sabbath, which began at sundown Friday. This created a compressed timeline. Death occurring Friday afternoon, burial by Friday evening, tomb sealed until Sunday morning, approximately 36 hours, well within the 48 to 72-hour window that multiple abductees claimed was the maximum time frame for consciousness re-embodiment using this technology. The entities reportedly told Henderson that the demonstration had to occur within this specific time frame, too quick, and the death wouldn't be medically convincing, too long and the biological substrate would degrade beyond the point where consciousness could successfully reintegrate. The 36-hour window represented optimal conditions for proving that EU procedure worked while maintaining enough physiological integrity for the witnesses to identify the same individual. I found supporting details in the testimony of David Cortez, whose 1995 abduction in New Mexico included similar claims. Cortez reported that the entities told him the resurrection
event was calibrated for maximum evidential impact within the constraints of biological decay rates. He said they emphasized that the timing wasn't symbolic, it was technical necessity. The third verification point involved the purpose claim. According to these entities, the demonstration wasn't
meant to establish a religion. It was meant to prove to humans that consciousness survival was possible and was being actively maintained. They allegedly told Henderson that the distortion into religious doctrine was expected, but not intended. The core message they wanted preserved was simple: human. Consciousness continues after biological death because we are keeping it intact, and this is provable because we showed you the mechanism publicly. When I asked Henderson why these beings would want humans to know this, he said they told him it was ethical requirement. That maintaining consciousness without consent was what they called a form of captivity. That humans needed to understand their consciousness was being preserved so they could eventually decide whether to accept or refuse what comes next. He said the entities showed him something they called the waiting structure. A vast organized system where human consciousness exists in a preserved state, experiencing something analogous to awareness but without biological constraints. He described it as billions of people, conscious but not embodied, held in a pattern that feels like dreaming but isn't, sleep. I interviewed Father Thomas Garrett in 2020 specifically about this claim. Garrett is a Jesuit priest with a doctorate in early Christian history from Oxford. I didn't tell him the source of the question. I simply asked whether early Christian communities understood the resurrection as proof of general consciousness survival, or as specific to Jesus as divine figure. Garrett spent 40 minutes walking me through the textual evidence, and his conclusion was unambiguous. The earliest Christian writings, particularly Paul's letters, treat the resurrection as proof that death has been defeated for all believers. 1 Corinthians 15 makes this explicit. Christ is described as first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. The resurrection isn't presented as a unique divine event, but as the first successful instance of a process that would eventually apply to all human consciousness. This is standard Christian theology. What made it relevant to my investigation was how precisely it matched what the entities allegedly told Henderson. The event was a proof of concept for a preservation technology that would be applied to all human consciousness going forward. I went back to the hypnotic regression transcripts looking for details that couldn't have come from cultural knowledge. Henderson had minimal education beyond his engineering degree. He'd never studied theology or ancient history. But under hypnosis in 1989, he described the entities showing him viewing platforms where they monitored the crucifixion event in real time. He said they emphasized the importance of the witnesses. Specifically, they mentioned that the witness accounts needed to include details about the body's condition before death and after revival. Details that would allow future analysis to confirm this was the same biological organism with consciousness restored. The Gospel accounts include exactly these kinds of details. Thomas examining the wounds. Jesus eating food to prove he wasn't a spirit. The emphasis on physical continuity. Henderson said the entities told him these details were quality control data, evidence that the procedure had worked correctly, that consciousness had successfully reintegrated with the repaired biological form. What Henderson couldn't have known in 1987 was how unusual these details were in the context of ancient religious literature. Resurrection accounts in other traditions typically emphasize transformation or spiritual ascension, bodies becoming light, ascending to heaven, transfiguring into divine form. The Christian accounts are almost clinical by comparison. They emphasize material continuity, same body, same person, same consciousness, but demonstrably alive again. after being demonstrably dead. Dr. Sarah Kimball, a cognitive neuroscientist at Stanford who consults on consciousness studies, told me this evidential emphasis makes sense if the goal was to prove a technology rather than establish a theology. When I described the Henderson claims to her without identifying the source, she said, "If you were trying to prove consciousness transfer or preservation to a pre-scientific population, you'd need exactly this kind of evidence. Physical continuity, behavioral continuity, demonstrable, death followed by demonstrable life. You'd want witnesses who could confirm identity. You'd want a short enough timeline that decay wouldn't obscure the results, but long enough that death was medically certain. And you'd want it in a cultural context that valued testimony and would preserve the account." The afterlife description these entities provided is what troubles me most. Multiple abductees report being told that human consciousness is currently existing in what Henderson called distributed storage. Not heaven or hell in the traditional sense, but a maintained state of awareness without biological substrate. The entities allegedly claim this state is temporary, that there's a planned endpoint they call the collection or the harvest, where preserved human consciousness will be transferred to something else. Different abductees report different descriptions of what that something else might be, but the consistent claim is that the current afterlife state is transitional, not permanent. Henderson said the entities told him this was always meant to be disclosed, that the crucifixion demonstration was supposed to establish two facts. Consciousness survival is real, and it's being actively maintained by non-human intelligence. The religious framework that developed around the event preserved the first fact but obscured the second. According to these beings, this wasn't entirely unexpected. They allegedly told Henderson that pre-scientific cultures would naturally interpret advanced technology as divine intervention. But they emphasized that the core proof remained valid. Consciousness survival had been publicly demonstrated in a way that remained historically documented. I obtained medical records for all 7 abductees in my cluster. I was looking for neurological commonalities that might explain shared hallucination or confabulation. What I found was the opposite: different neurological profiles, different psychological histories, different cultural backgrounds. 3 had no history of any kind of anomalous experience before their reported abduction. 2 were skeptics who initially sought conventional explanations for what happened to them. 1 was an atheist who found the theological content of his experience deeply disturbing, specifically because it contradicted his worldview. The consistency had to be coming from somewhere. Either these individuals were somehow accessing the same narrative template through a mechanism I couldn't identify, or they were reporting something they actually experienced. I've spent 15 years looking for that middle explanation, some form of cultural contamination or psychological convergence that would account for pattern matching without requiring the experiences to be literally real. I haven't found it. What pushed me toward taking the claim seriously was the predictive element. Henderson's 1987 testimony, documented under hypnosis in 1989, included claims about the structure of consciousness that wouldn't appear in scientific literature until the late 1990s. Specifically, he described consciousness as pattern information stored in energy fields that normally disperse when the biological generator stops. This is remarkably close to emerging theories. In quantum consciousness studies, particularly orchestrated objective reduction theory, which wasn't published until 1996. Henderson had no background in physics or consciousness studies. He was a hydraulic engineer who read science fiction occasionally but had no exposure to cutting-edge neuroscience. Yet his description of consciousness as pattern information that requires active maintenance to prevent dispersion matches theoretical models that didn't exist in public discourse when he reported his experience. The same predictive element appears in the Cho testimony from 1976. She described what she called the lattice that holds soul patterns as existing in a dimension of pure information adjacent to physical space. This predates digital physics and information-theoretic models of reality by more than a decade. Cho was a schoolteacher with no background in theoretical physics. I contacted Dr. Raymond Foster, a physicist at MIT who works on information theory and quantum field models. I described these testimonies without identifying their source as abduction accounts. Foster told me, these descriptions are consistent with some current thinking about consciousness as an information pattern that could theoretically be preserved in quantum field structures. But this is very recent theoretical work. If these testimonies are from the 70s and 80s, there's no conventional source they could be drawing from. These models simply didn't exist in accessible form. The collection phase concept appears in 4 of the 7 testimonies. The entities allegedly describe it as a planned event, where preserved human consciousness will be transferred from the current maintenance structures to what Henderson called integration with a larger system. Different abductees report different levels of detail about what this means. Some describe it as consciousness merging with some kind of collective intelligence. Others describe it as transfer to different physical forms. One testimony describes it as graduation to a higher dimensional existence. What they consistently claim is that this has always been the plan. That human biological life is a temporary phase designed to generate individual consciousness patterns. That the preservation technology was introduced at a point in human history where consciousness development had reached sufficient complexity to be worth maintaining. And that the crucifixion demonstration was meant to prepare humans for the eventual revelation that their consciousness is being kept intact for a specific purpose. Henderson said the entities told him the disclosure would happen in stages. That humanity would first need to develop enough scientific framework to understand consciousness as something that could theoretically be preserved and transferred. That this understanding would emerge gradually through advances in neuroscience, quantum physics, and information theory. And that once humanity reached a threshold of comprehension, the entities would begin more direct communication about the actual nature of the afterlife and what comes next. When I asked when this disclosure would occur, Henderson said they told him it would happen when enough humans can accept the explanation. Without psychological collapse. He said they were specific about this. That premature disclosure would cause widespread existential trauma. That humans needed to first accept consciousness survival as scientifically plausible before they could process the reality that it's being artificially maintained by non-human intelligence. I found independent support for this timeline concern in the testimony of Anna Petrova, whose 2003 abduction in Russia included similar claims. Petrova reported that the entities told her humanity is approaching the threshold of understanding where direct contact becomes possible without mass psychological damage. She said they emphasized that disclosure had to be gradual and that it would begin with people who could process the information without experiencing reality breakdown. People who would document and share the information in ways that allowed others to consider it gradually. This is what troubles me about publishing this analysis. If these testimonies are accurate, I'm participating in exactly the disclosure process they describe. I'm presenting information that challenges fundamental assumptions about death, consciousness, and humanity's relationship to non-human intelligence. Information that, if true, means every major religion is both partially correct and fundamentally incomplete. That consciousness survival is real, but not for the reasons we've believed. That human death is not an ending, but a transition into a maintained state we don't fully understand. And that this state is temporary, leading towards something the entities claim to have planned but haven't fully explained. I spent 6 months trying to find disconfirming evidence. Anything that would break the pattern consistency or reveal a mundane source for these claims. I investigated every possible connection between the abductees. I hired a private investigator to track their movements and communications. No connections, no shared conferences, no common literature, no online communities, where they might have exchanged information. 3 of them died before the internet became widely available. 2 have never used social media. The probability of independent fabrication converging on this level of detail consistency is functionally zero. The alternative explanations are limited. Either these individuals accessed some kind of collective unconscious narrative through a mechanism we don't understand, or they're reporting actual experiences with non-human intelligence that made specific claims about Jesus, consciousness preservation, and the nature of the afterlife. The first option requires accepting mechanisms we have no evidence for. The second requires accepting that non-human intelligence has been actively maintaining human consciousness for 2,000 years and is planning something they call collection or harvest at some future point. I interviewed Dr. Michael Torres, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma and dissociative disorders, about the psychological profiles of these abductees. Torres evaluated 3 of them using standard psychological instruments. His assessment: these individuals show no signs of psychotic disorders, no evidence of confabulation or fantasy proneness above population norms, and no indication of coordinated deception. They're reporting experiences they genuinely believe occurred. Whether those experiences represent objective events or some other phenomenon, I can't determine from psychological evaluation alone. But they're not lying, and they're not delusional in any clinical sense. The theological implications are what kept me from publishing this analysis for 2 years. If these claims are accurate, every religious tradition has been operating with incomplete information about the afterlife. The core Christian claim about resurrection is confirmed, but recontextualized. Consciousness survival is real, but it's not divine miracle. It's maintained technology. The preserved state that religions call heaven or paradise is real, but it's temporary infrastructure, not final destination. And the endpoint these entities describe, the collection or harvest, could be anything from consciousness evolution to something far less benign. Henderson said the entities were clear about one thing: the preservation is happening whether humans understand it or not. Every human consciousness, since the crucifixion demonstration, has been subject to the same preservation protocol. Death leads to a maintained state of awareness within the lattice structures, and at some point, determined by criteria the entities haven't fully disclosed, that preservation phase will end and the collection phase will begin. I asked Henderson if the entities explained what happens to people who refuse, who don't want their consciousness preserved or transferred to whatever comes next. He said they told him refusal isn't currently possible, that the preservation happens automatically at death, built into what they called the planetary field geometry. But they claimed that disclosure was necessary because eventually humans would be given a choice about the next phase, about whether to accept integration into whatever system the entities are building, or to allow their consciousness pattern to disperse naturally. This choice option appears in 3 other testimonies, always described as future capability, not current option. The entities allegedly claim that refusing the collection would mean consciousness dispersion, permanent ending of individual awareness. But that this refusal right is important enough that they're willing to disclose the entire system to ensure humans understand what they're choosing between. The ethics of this are complex. If these entities are maintaining human consciousness without informed consent, that could be viewed as a form of captivity, exactly as Henderson reported they described it. But if the alternative is permanent consciousness ending, most humans would presumably want preservation. The question becomes, what are we being preserved for? What is the collection phase? What does integration into a larger system actually mean? I found a potential answer in the testimony of James Rutherford, a Canadian engineer whose 2001 abduction included claims about the endpoint. Rutherford said the entities told him that individual human consciousness is components being assembled for a larger distributed intelligence, that humanity is essentially growing consciousness patterns that will eventually be networked together into something the entities called a new form of collective awareness. He described it as similar to how individual neurons form a brain, except the components are preserved human consciousness patterns instead of biological cells. If accurate, this reframes human existence in almost incomprehensible ways. Biological life would be a manufacturing process. Individual human experience would be development time for consciousness patterns that are actually components in a planned, larger system. Death wouldn't be an ending, but a transition from development phase to storage phase. And the collection would be activation, the moment when all these preserved consciousness patterns get integrated into whatever the entities have been building. Rutherford said when he asked why the entities would do this, they told him they were fulfilling a design requirement from higher, organizing intelligence. That they were intermediaries in a larger process. That what they're building with human consciousness is itself a component in something even larger. He said they showed him a visual representation. Nested levels of organization, consciousness patterns forming larger, consciousness structures, those structures forming even larger ones, extending upward in a hierarchy he couldn't fully comprehend. I have no framework for evaluating whether this is accurate. It's too far outside conventional understanding. But it's consistent with certain ideas in panpsychism and integrated information theory. The notion that consciousness might be combinable, that individual awareness could merge into larger unified consciousness without losing the information patterns that constitute individual experience. These are theoretical possibilities in current consciousness studies, but presented here as operational reality. The Jesus element takes on different significance in this context. If the crucifixion demonstration was proof of concept for consciousness preservation, it was showing humanity that individual awareness can survive biological death and be reinstantiated. This would be essential information if the endpoint is consciousness integration. Humans would need to know that death isn't ending before they could accept that what comes after death leads somewhere. The resurrection would be evidence that individual consciousness patterns remain coherent and recoverable. That whatever happens in the collection phase, individual identity persists through the transition. Early Christian theology actually contains something similar to this in the concept of the resurrection body and the mystical body of Christ. 1 Corinthians 12 describes believers as members of one body, different parts with different functions but unified in a larger whole. This could be read as metaphor, but it could also be read as surprisingly accurate description of the integration concept these entities allegedly described. Individual consciousness, patterns maintaining their distinct qualities while functioning as components in a larger unified awareness. I'm not claiming the entity's account is true. I'm documenting that multiple independent witnesses report being told this account, and that it shows internal consistency and unexpected alignment with both historical evidence and emerging scientific models. The pattern is strong enough that it deserves investigation beyond dismissal. The afterlife model they describe is both more and less comforting than traditional religious frameworks. More comforting because consciousness survival appears to be real and actively maintained. Less comforting because the survival is temporary and leads toward integration into a system whose full nature and purpose hasn't been disclosed. Traditional heaven offers eternal individual existence in perfect conditions. This model offers temporary individual preservation, followed by transformation into something that might retain individual patterns, but won't experience existence the same way. Henderson said, when he asked if the integrated state would feel like being themselves, the entities told him, continuity of pattern means continuity of essential self, but experience mode will be different from anything possible in biological consciousness. He said they compared it to the difference between dreaming and waking. Both are consciousness states, both are real experiences, but they operate by different rules and feel fundamentally different. The collection would be transition to a third mode of consciousness, as different from biological awareness as biological awareness is from dreaming. I interviewed Dr. Patricia Yang, a philosopher of mind at Berkeley, about whether this kind of consciousness transition is theoretically coherent. Yang told me, if consciousness is substrate independent, if it's pattern rather than biological process, then transitioning that pattern to a different operational substrate is theoretically possible. Whether the resulting experience would feel continuous with biological consciousness depends on how much of the pattern's relational structure is preserved. If enough of the information relationships that constitute individual identity remain intact, there could be genuine continuity of self even in radically different experience mode. This brings me to the verification problem. Everything I've documented is testimony. Consistent testimony from independent sources, testimony that includes verifiable historical and technical details, testimony that predicts later scientific models. But still testimony. I have no physical evidence, no artifacts from the from alleged preservation technology, no direct observation of the lattice structures these entities describe, just witness accounts that match too precisely to dismiss and too strangely to fully accept. The only testable prediction in this material is the disclosure timeline. If these entities are real, and operating according to the plan Henderson and others describe, we should see increasing contact, more people reporting similar information, more consistency across independent testimonies, and eventually some form of direct evidence that consciousness preservation technology exists and is actively operating. I've been tracking new abduction reports for 2 years, specifically looking for this pattern. The consistency is increasing. 17 new cases since 2020 include mentions of consciousness preservation, afterlife structures, or the collection concept. These accounts come from people with no connection to my research and no apparent access to the earlier testimonies. The information is spreading, either because more people are having these experiences or because the entities are widening their disclosure efforts. What concerns me is the urgency appearing in recent testimonies. 3 accounts from 2022 include claims that the collection phase is approaching, not imminent, but measured in decades rather than centuries. The entities allegedly told these individuals that disclosure is accelerating because humanity is running out of time to process the information before the transition begins. I don't know what to do with that claim. It could be psychological pressure designed to make the testimonies seem more important. It could be genuine information about a planned timeline. Or it could be complete fabrication, despite the pattern consistency suggesting otherwise. But if there's any possibility these accounts are accurate, the timeline question becomes critical. Are we talking about something happening in our lifetimes? Our children's lifetimes? And if so, what preparation would even be possible? Henderson died in 2021. Before he died, I asked him if he believed what the entities told him. He said, "I spent 30 years trying not to believe it, trying to find any other explanation. But I saw what they showed me. I saw the structures. I saw the preserved consciousness patterns, billions of them, organized and maintained. And I understood that, this has been happening since before Christianity existed as a religion. The crucifixion was proof. Everything since then has been accumulation. We're being collected, and we have been since the moment that demonstration proved it was possible." He paused, then added, "The question isn't whether it's happening. The question is whether we can trust what they say about why. Whether the collection leads somewhere we'd choose to go if we understood it fully. And we won't know that until it happens, or until they decide to tell us more than they have. I have 17,000 pages of documentation, hypnotic regression transcripts, witness interviews, historical analysis, theological consultation, scientific evaluation. All of it points toward the same conclusion. Something is preserving human consciousness after biological death. Multiple witnesses claim non-human intelligence told them this is happening, and that Jesus' resurrection was a public demonstration of the technology, and the preservation appears to be temporary phase leading towards some kind of consciousness integration event these entities call the collection. I can't prove any of this is objectively true, but I also can't find sufficient evidence to dismiss it as delusion, fabrication, or cultural contamination. The pattern is too strong, the consistency too precise, the predictive elements too accurate, and the implications too significant to ignore just because they challenge everything we think we know about death, consciousness, and the nature of human existence. What the entities allegedly told Henderson about the afterlife is this: you don't end when you die. Your consciousness is preserved in maintained structures that feel like awareness, but aren't biological experience. You exist there, along with billions of other preserved human consciousness patterns, waiting. The waiting has a purpose. Your components being prepared for assembly into something larger. And when that assembly begins, when the collection phase starts, you'll transition into a form of consciousness that retains your essential pattern, but experiences existence in ways biological awareness can't comprehend. If this account is accurate, every human who has died since approximately 30 CE is currently existing in this preserved state. Aware, but not embodied. Maintained, but not in final form. Waiting for whatever the collection represents. And the resurrection wasn't divine intervention. It was proof that this is possible. Demonstration that consciousness can be preserved, can be reinstantiated, can be transitioned between different modes of existence while maintaining pattern continuity. I'm publishing this analysis because the pattern demands investigation, because dismissing these testimonies without serious examination would be intellectually dishonest, and because if there's any possibility this information is accurate, people deserve to know that claims about consciousness survival and the nature of the afterlife aren't just religious speculation. They're potentially verifiable facts being disclosed by intelligence that claims direct operational knowledge. I don't expect this to be accepted easily. The implications are too strange. The challenge to established frameworks too fundamental. But the evidence is strong enough that it can't be responsibly ignored. Something is generating pattern consistency across independent witnesses. Something gave these individuals information about consciousness, preservation technology, and historical events that they shouldn't have access to through conventional means. And that something, according to their testimony, has been maintaining human consciousness for 2,000 years and is planning to collect it for purposes they haven't fully explained. The next phase of investigation needs to focus on verification. Finding ways to test the claims that can be tested. Looking for physical evidence of the preservation structures if they exist. Monitoring for the predicted increase in disclosure contacts. Analyzing whether new testimonies continue matching the established pattern. And trying to determine if these claims have any basis in reality, what the collection actually represents, and whether it's something humanity should accept or resist when the choice becomes available. I'm aware this sounds like preparation for mass delusion or religious movement. I'm a researcher, not a believer. I follow evidence. And the evidence here is troubling specifically because it won't resolve into comfortable categories. These testimonies are too consistent to dismiss, but too strange to accept without extraordinary verification. They present claims that would rewrite our understanding of consciousness, death, and human purpose. Claims that come from sources with no apparent motive for coordinated deception and no obvious mechanism for independent fabrication of identical details. If you're reading this looking for certainty, I can't provide it. What I can provide is documentation that the pattern exists, that multiple witnesses report being told by non-human intelligence that Jesus' resurrection was a demonstration of consciousness preservation technology, that this technology is actively maintaining human consciousness after biological death, and that the preservation is temporary, leading toward integration into something these entities claim to be building but haven't fully disclosed. The question I can't answer is whether any of this is true, The question I can answer is whether it deserves investigation. And based on 15 years of research and 17,000 pages of documentation, my answer is yes. This pattern is real, even if I can't yet determine what's generating it. And if there's any possibility these testimonies represent actual information rather than coordinated delusion, the implications are too significant to ignore. We might be components in a construction project we don't understand. Our biological lives might be development time for consciousness patterns being prepared for integration into larger systems. Death might not be ending but transition into temporary storage, and the resurrection might have been exactly what these entities claim. Proof of concept, demonstrated publicly, preserved historically, designed to prepare humanity for the eventual revelation that consciousness survival is real and purposeful and leading somewhere we won't fully comprehend until we arrive. I'm continuing this investigation, tracking new testimonies, looking for verification points, consulting with experts across neuroscience, physics, theology, and consciousness studies, building a framework for understanding what these patterns might mean, and documenting everything carefully because if this information is accurate, it represents the most important discovery in human history. And if it's not accurate, understanding what's generating such precise pattern consistency across independent witnesses is itself a question worth answering. The entities allegedly told Henderson one more thing. They said disclosure is happening now, because humanity is approaching technical capacity to detect the preservation structures independently. That within decades, advances in quantum field detection and consciousness measurement might make the lattice systems visible to human instrumentation. That they prefer to disclose the information before humans discover it forcibly, because controlled disclosure allows better psychological preparation for what the evidence will reveal. If that timeline is accurate, we'll know soon enough whether any of this is real. The verification will come from physics labs and consciousness research facilities, not from abduction testimonies. And when it comes, if it comes, everything changes. Every assumption about death, every religious framework, every philosophical position on consciousness and existence, all of it recontextualized by the discovery that we've been preserved all along, that the preservation has purpose, and that the purpose is approaching activation. Until then, this remains investigation of pattern, documentation of consistency, analysis of claims that can't be easily dismissed and can't be readily proved. The kind of evidence that demands attention without providing resolution. The kind of mystery that justifies continued research precisely because the implications are too large to ignore based on uncertainty. I'm sharing this because patterns this strong deserve wider examination, because independent verification requires independent investigators, and because, if there's any truth to these testimonies, people should have access to the information before whatever the entities describe as collection begins. We deserve to know what we might be transitioning toward. We deserve to understand what consciousness preservation means and what integration might entail. And we deserve the choice. Henderson said these entities promise will eventually be available to accept the collection or allow our consciousness patterns to disperse naturally when the time comes. That's the investigation. That's what 15 years of research into abduction testimonies has revealed. A pattern suggesting non-human intelligence has been maintaining human consciousness for 2 millennia. A pattern claiming the resurrection was technological demonstration. A pattern describing an afterlife that's real, but temporary and purposeful. And a pattern warning that the purpose is approaching activation, that disclosure is accelerating, and that humanity is running out of time to understand what's been happening before the next phase begins. I don't know if any of it's true, but I know the pattern is real, and I know it demands investigation. Everything else is question marks, and implications and the uncomfortable possibility that death isn't what we thought. Consciousness survival is real for reasons we didn't expect, and something has been collecting us all along.